The morning sun barely touched the grand windows of the Reinhardt mansion when Maria pushed open the heavy wooden door with her hip, balancing a bucket of cleaning supplies in one hand and her daughter's small suitcase in the other. It was going to be another long day, but at least this time she wouldn't have to worry about leaving 12-year-old Elena alone at home. "Stay close to me and don't touch anything," Maria whispered to her daughter as they walked through the marble hallway. Her voice carried that familiar mix of exhaustion and worry that Elena had grown used to over the years. Elena nodded quietly, her eyes already wandering to the oil paintings that lined the walls. She had been to the mansion a few times before, always during summer breaks when Maria couldn't find anyone to watch her, but today felt different somehow. Today, the Reinhardt family was preparing for one of their famous evening gatherings, and the entire house buzzed with an energy Elena had never felt before. The girl clutched her schoolbooks tighter as they passed through room after room, each one more beautiful than the last. Crystal chandeliers hung from painted ceilings. Velvet curtains framed windows that overlooked gardens so perfect they looked like paintings themselves. Everything smelled of polish and fresh flowers and something else Elena couldn't quite name. Something that felt like money. "You can sit in the music room while I work," Maria said, guiding her daughter through a set of double doors. "Do your homework and stay quiet. The family doesn't like to be reminded that staff children are in the house." Elena stepped into the room and forgot to breathe. She had seen pianos before, of course. There was an old battered one at her school that no one played anymore because half the keys didn't work. But this instrument looked like it belonged in a palace. The wood gleamed so brightly she could almost see her reflection in it. The keys seemed to glow white and black, perfect and untouched, waiting for the right hands to bring them to life. "Mama, it's beautiful," Elena whispered. Maria barely glanced at the piano as she began dusting the bookshelves that lined the walls. "It's just a thing, my love. A very expensive thing that we cannot afford to damage. Sit in that chair by the window and don't wander." But Elena couldn't stop staring at the piano as she settled into the velvet armchair her mother had pointed to. She opened her mathematics book, but the numbers seemed to dance off the page. Her attention kept drifting back to that magnificent instrument standing in the center of the room like a sleeping giant. Around mid-morning, everything changed. The double doors swung open and a boy about Elena's age walked in, followed by a tall, thin man carrying a leather folder. The boy had perfectly combed hair and wore clothes that probably cost more than Maria made in a month. He walked past Elena without seeming to notice she existed, which didn't surprise her at all. "Good morning, Master Wilhelm," the thin man said stiffly. "Shall we begin with your scales?" Elena watched as the boy sat at the piano with all the enthusiasm of someone sitting down for a tooth extraction. The man, who she assumed was his teacher, opened the folder and placed sheet music on the stand. "We've been working on this Bach prelude for 3 weeks now," the teacher said, his voice carrying a note of barely concealed frustration. "Perhaps today you will remember to count properly." Wilhelm sighed dramatically and began to play. Even to Elena's untrained ears, something seemed off. The notes came out mechanical and choppy, like he was fighting with the piano instead of making music with it. Several times he stopped, started over, and muttered complaints under his breath. "No, no, no," the teacher interrupted, tapping his pen against the music stand. "You must feel the rhythm. Let me demonstrate." When the teacher played, everything changed. The same notes that had sounded broken under Wilhelm's fingers suddenly flowed like water. Elena leaned forward in her chair, forgetting completely about her mathematics homework. She watched the teacher's hands move across the keys, noting how his fingers curved just so, how his wrists stayed relaxed, how his whole body seemed to sway slightly with the music. The lesson continued for an hour and Elena absorbed every single moment. She watched how the teacher corrected Wilhelm's posture, explained about tempo and dynamics, demonstrated difficult passages over and over, while Wilhelm looked increasingly bored. Her mother came in twice to empty trash bins, giving Elena warning looks both times to remind her to stay invisible. When the lesson finally ended and Wilhelm practically ran from the room, Elena sat very still in her chair, her mind replaying everything she had just witnessed. The mathematics book lay forgotten in her lap, still open to page 37. This became their routine over the following weeks. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Wilhelm had his piano lessons and Elena sat in her corner like a piece of furniture, watching and listening and memorizing. She learned that the teacher's name was Professor Hoffman, She learned that Wilhelm was terrible at practicing and that Professor Hoffman was losing patience with his privileged student who treated music lessons like punishment. But more importantly, Elena learned about music itself. She learned the names of the notes and how they related to the keys. She learned about crescendos and diminuendos, about major and minor scales, about how the pedals change the sound. She learned all of this without touching a single key, without asking a single question, simply by watching and listening with every ounce of attention she possessed. At night, back in their small apartment across town, Elena would sit at their wobbly kitchen table and move her fingers across the wooden surface, practicing the patterns she had seen Professor Hoffman demonstrate. Her mother, too tired from 14-hour workdays to notice, would smile and pat her head before collapsing into bed. "What are you doing, little one?" Maria asked one evening, watching her daughter's fingers dance across the table. "Just thinking, Mama," Elena replied, not wanting to explain the dream growing inside her chest. A dream that felt too big and impossible for their tiny apartment with its leaking ceiling and the neighbor's dog that barked all night. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening, and the Reinhardt mansion glowed with lights from every window. Carriages pulled up to the front entrance, delivering guests in expensive clothes and jewelry that caught the lamplight. Maria worked frantically, making sure every surface sparkled, every glass shone, every detail was perfect for the gathering. Elena sat in her usual corner of the music room, trying to be invisible as the guests began to filter in. They carried champagne glasses and spoke in voices that sounded confident and bright, discussing things Elena didn't understand. Art exhibitions and opera performances and upcoming trips to Paris. At the center of the room, that beautiful piano waited like always. But tonight, it seemed to call to Elena more strongly than ever before. Tonight, people who actually understood music would fill this room. Tonight, someone would surely play that magnificent instrument and make it sing the way it deserved to. But as the room filled with people and conversation grew louder, the piano remained silent. It seemed the guests were more interested in being seen than in actually appreciating the music room they stood in. Elena clutched her schoolbook and tried to make herself smaller. Something was building in the air, though she couldn't have explained what, something that made her heart beat faster and her palms sweat slightly. She didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. Her quiet observation, her secret learning, her silent dream. All of it was about to collide with a moment that would alter the course of her entire life. The mansion's master, Herr Reinhardt himself, was making his way through the crowd, and his eyes had just landed on the girl in the corner who had been watching his son's piano lessons for weeks. Herr Reinhardt was a man who believed he understood people. After 30 years of building his banking empire, he had learned to read faces, to spot weakness, to know when someone was pretending to be something they weren't. And right now, looking at the girl in the corner of his music room, he saw something that amused him. The child wasn't looking at the guests in their fine clothes and expensive jewelry. She wasn't staring at the elaborate cakes on the dessert table or the crystal champagne glasses that caught the light like diamonds. Her eyes were fixed on his piano with a longing so intense it was almost painful to witness. "My dear guests," Herr Reinhardt said, raising his voice above the conversation. The room gradually fell quiet as people turned to face him. "I see we have an unexpected music lover among us this evening." Maria, who had been refilling wine glasses near the doorway, felt her blood turn to ice. She knew that tone. She had heard wealthy men use it before, right before they found ways to humiliate people like her, people who had no power to fight back. Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward her. Her face burned hot and she wanted to disappear into the velvet cushion of her chair. She clutched her schoolbook so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Come here, child," Herr Reinhardt said, gesturing with his champagne glass. It wasn't really a request. It was a command dressed up in polite words. Elena stood on shaky legs and walked across the room. The sea of well-dressed guests parted for her, and she could feel their eyes examining her simple dress, her worn shoes, the way her hair was pulled back in a plain braid. She stopped a few feet away from Herr Reinhardt and kept her eyes on the floor. "What's your name?" he asked. "Elena, sir," she whispered. "Speak up, my dear. No one can hear you." "Elena," she repeated louder this time, though her voice still trembled. "And you're Maria's daughter, yes? The housekeeper?" He didn't wait for an answer. "I've noticed you sitting in this room during my son's lessons. You watch very intently. Tell me, do you enjoy music? Elena nodded, still not looking up. She doesn't mean any harm, sir, Maria said quickly, stepping forward. I'll make sure she waits in the kitchen from now on. I apologize if she's been a disturbance. Nonsense, Herr Reinhardt interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. I'm simply curious about our young observer here. He turned back to Elena. You watch my son struggle with his lessons week after week. You sit there so quietly, like you're trying to memorize every note. Tell me, Elena, do you think you could do better than Wilhelm? The room erupted in polite laughter. Someone in the back made a comment about the help having aspirations that caused another ripple of amusement. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I asked you a question, Herr Reinhardt pressed, and now there was an edge to his voice that made it clear this wasn't kindness. This was entertainment. He was going to embarrass her in front of all these people, and there was nothing she or her mother could do about it. I don't know, sir, Elena said quietly. Come now, surely you have an opinion. You've watched enough lessons. He gestured broadly to his guests. Look at all these cultured people. They've paid for their children to study with the finest teachers in Vienna. They've invested thousands in musical education. Surely you don't think that simply watching a few lessons makes you their equal. The word stung because Elena knew they were meant to. She finally looked up and met Herr Reinhardt's eyes. There was something cruel there, something that enjoyed having power over others. She had seen that look before, on the faces of shopkeepers who refused to serve her mother, on the faces of Wilhelm's friends when they saw her in the hallway. No, sir, she said. I don't think I'm anyone's equal. Good. At least you understand your place. He took a sip of his champagne and Elena thought the torture was over. She started to turn away, but his next word stopped her cold. However, since you seem so fascinated by the instrument, why don't you play something for us? The room went completely silent. Maria made a small sound of distress. Sir, she doesn't know how, Maria began. But Herr Reinhardt cut her off with a sharp look. Let the girl speak for herself. He turned back to Elena. Well, don't you want to try? Or have all those hours of watching been for nothing? Elena's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She looked at the piano, that beautiful instrument she had dreamed about touching for weeks. Then she looked at her mother's frightened face. Maria was shaking her head slightly, silently begging her daughter not to make things worse, but something else was rising inside Elena. Something stronger than fear. It was anger, yes, but also a fierce determination that she hadn't known she possessed. This man wanted to humiliate her. He wanted her to refuse so he could mock her cowardice, or to try and fail so he could mock her presumption. Either way, he expected her to give him what he wanted. What would you like me to play, sir? Elena heard herself say. A murmur ran through the crowd. Herr Reinhardt's eyebrows rose slightly. He clearly hadn't expected that response. Oh, you're bold, aren't you? He smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. Very well. Let's make this interesting. He walked over to a cabinet and pulled out a folder of sheet music. He flipped through it deliberately slowly, making everyone wait, building the tension. Finally, he pulled out a single sheet and held it up. Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu in C-sharp minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. Even accomplished pianists struggle with it. He placed the music on the piano stand with exaggerated care. I'm sure you've seen Professor Hoffman demonstrate it during lessons, haven't you? Elena's stomach dropped. She had seen it, yes, once, 3 weeks ago. Professor Hoffman had played it to show Wilhelm what real mastery looked like, after Wilhelm had complained that his current piece was too difficult. The professor's hands had flown across the keys so fast they were almost a blur. The notes had tumbled over each other in a cascade that seemed impossible for human fingers to execute. She had watched it once. Just once. I'm waiting, Herr Reinhardt said, gesturing to the piano bench. Unless you'd like to admit that watching and doing are very different things. Elena walked to the piano. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Behind her, she could hear the whispers starting up. Some people sounded sympathetic. Most sounded anticipatory, like they were about to witness a train wreck and couldn't look away. She sat down on the bench and looked at the sheet music. The notes seemed to swim on the page. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the keys, feeling the cool ivory under her fingertips for the first time in her life. Anytime you're ready, Herr Reinhardt said. He had moved to lean against the fireplace mantel, champagne glass in hand, the picture of casual cruelty. Elena closed her eyes. She thought about all those hours of watching, all those nights of practicing on the kitchen table, all those moments of silent dreaming. She thought about her mother, who worked until her hands bled to give Elena a better life. She thought about how people like Herr Reinhardt believed that people like her didn't deserve beautiful things. Then she opened her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The first notes tumbled out like water over stones, exactly as she remembered. Her fingers found the keys as if they had always known where to go. The muscle memory she had built from watching, from imagining, from silently practicing took over. And the music that filled the room wasn't just technically correct. It was alive. Elena didn't just play the notes, she felt them. Every crescendo, every delicate trill, every thundering chord spoke of everything she had ever felt. The loneliness of being invisible. The beauty of dreams that seemed impossible. The fierce hope that lived in her chest despite everything. The room had gone completely still. No one moved. No one breathed. They just listened as this girl in her simple dress and worn shoes made the piano sing in a way it had never sung before. And in that moment, everything changed. The music poured from Elena's fingers like it had been waiting there all along, just beneath her skin, desperate to escape. Her hands moved across the keys with a confidence that surprised even her. The complex patterns that had seemed impossible when she watched Professor Hoffman now felt natural, as if her fingers had always known this dance. She forgot about the room full of people. She forgot about Herr Reinhardt and his cruel smile. She forgot about her mother's frightened face and her own worn shoes, and the way everyone had laughed at her. There was only the music, only the feeling of the keys beneath her fingers, only the sound filling the air around her. The piece demanded everything from her. Her right hand flew through the rapid melody, while her left hand provided the steady rolling bass line. It was like trying to think two different thoughts at the same time, like having a conversation with yourself in two different languages. But somehow, impossibly, Elena made it work. The notes cascaded and tumbled, rose and fell, whispered and shouted. She played the gentle middle section with a tenderness that made something ache in the chest of everyone listening. Then the opening theme returned, even faster this time, building and building until it felt like the whole room might burst from the pressure of so much beauty contained in one space. When Elena struck the final chord and lifted her hands from the keys, the silence that followed was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. For a moment, she thought she had done something wrong. Maybe she had played it incorrectly. Maybe she had made a fool of herself after all. Then the room exploded. The applause came like thunder. People weren't just clapping politely. They were on their feet, shouting and cheering like they had just witnessed something miraculous. An elderly woman in pearls had tears streaming down her face. A man in the back was shaking his head in disbelief, saying, "Impossible. Impossible," over and over again. Elena turned on the piano bench, her face flushed and her hands shaking now that the music had stopped. She saw her mother crying, one hand pressed to her mouth in shock. She saw Professor Hoffman staring at her with his mouth hanging open, his carefully composed expression completely shattered. And she saw Herr Reinhardt, still leaning against the fireplace mantel, but no longer smiling. His champagne glass hung forgotten in his hand, and his face had gone completely white. "Who taught you?" The voice came from the back of the room, cutting through the applause. A tall man with silver hair pushed his way through the crowd. He moved with the kind of authority that made people step aside automatically. "Child, who was your teacher?" Elena stood up from the piano bench, suddenly feeling very small again. "No one, sir. I watched the lessons. I watched Professor Hoffman teaching, and I practiced on my kitchen table at night." "You practiced on a table?" The silver-haired man looked at her like she had just told him she could fly. "You're telling me you've never actually touched a piano before tonight?" "No, sir. I mean, yes, sir. This was my first time." The man turned to address the room, his voice ringing with excitement. "Do you all understand what we've just witnessed? This child played Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu perfectly on her first attempt at a real piano. Do you comprehend how impossible that is? Now let's not get carried away," Herr Reinhardt said, finally finding his voice. He pushed off from the mantel, trying to regain control of the situation. "The girl played adequately, I'll grant you that. But perfect? That's quite an exaggeration. I am Dmitri Volkov," the silver-haired man said, turning to face Herr Reinhardt. "I have performed in every major concert hall in Europe. I have studied under the masters and taught at the conservatory for 20 years. And I tell you, Reinhardt, that what this child just did was not adequate. It was extraordinary. The name Dmitry Volkov sent another ripple through the crowd. Even Elena, who knew nothing about the music world, could tell this was someone important. Very important. She has natural talent, certainly, Herr Reinhardt said, his voice tight. But talent without proper training and breeding is just a parlor trick. My son has been studying for 5 years. Your son couldn't play that piece if his life depended on it, Professor Hoffman interrupted, and everyone turned to stare at him. The teacher looked like he was in shock, but there was something fierce in his eyes now. I've been trying to teach Wilhelm for 5 years, and he can barely make it through a simple Mozart sonata. This girl learned more from watching my lessons than your son learned from receiving them. How dare you? Herr Reinhardt started, but Dmitry Volkov held up his hand. Let's speak plainly, shall we? The famous pianist moved to stand beside Elena, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. This child possesses a gift that appears perhaps once in a generation. Maybe less. To waste such a gift would be criminal. What are you suggesting? Asked a woman in an elaborate hat. That we send a housekeeper's daughter to the conservatory? You can't be serious. I am completely serious, Dmitry said. In fact, I'll go further. I'll take her as my personal student. I'll sponsor her education myself. The room erupted in conversation. Some people seemed excited by the idea. Others looked scandalized. Elena felt dizzy, like the floor was tilting beneath her feet. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to girls like her. This is absurd, Herr Reinhardt said, his face now flushed red. Maria, collect your daughter. This evening has gotten out of hand, but Maria didn't move. She stood frozen near the doorway, tears still streaming down her face. Looking between her daughter and Dmitry Volkov like she was watching a dream she was afraid to believe in. Wait. Elena surprised herself by speaking up. Everyone turned to look at her again. Herr Reinhardt, sir. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you. I didn't mean to. I love music. I've always loved it for as long as I can remember. And I know I'm nobody, and I know I don't belong in a place like this, but... Stop, Dmitry said softly. Never apologize for your gift. Never make yourself small to make others comfortable. This is my house, Herr Reinhardt said coldly. And Maria is my employee. If she wants to keep her position, she'll remove her daughter from this room immediately and will forget this entire embarrassing incident. The threat hung in the air like poison. Maria needed this job. They needed the money. Their tiny apartment and their simple life depended on Herr Reinhardt's goodwill. Elena felt her brief moment of hope crumbling. Of course it had been too good to be true. Of course reality was going to crash back down on them. Then perhaps Maria needs a new employer, Dmitry said calmly. Excuse me, I have a large house that requires staff. My current housekeeper has been asking for an assistant for months. Dmitry looked directly at Maria. I can match whatever Reinhardt pays you and provide a small cottage on the grounds. That way Elena can live at home while attending the conservatory. You can't be serious, Herr Reinhardt sputtered. You'd hire her just to spite me? I'd hire her because her daughter has a gift that deserves to be nurtured. And because any man who would use a woman's livelihood to silence that gift doesn't deserve loyal employees. Dmitry turned to Maria. What do you say? The choice is yours. Maria looked at her daughter. Elena looked back at her mother. For a moment, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. When would we start? Maria asked quietly. Herr Reinhardt's face went from red to purple. You ungrateful. I think it's time for you to leave, Reinhardt, said the elderly woman in pearls. You've embarrassed yourself enough for one evening. Other voices joined hers, agreeing. The very people who had come to Herr Reinhardt's party were now turning on him, united in their fascination with the girl who had played impossible music. This isn't over, Herr Reinhardt said, pointing at Dmitry. You think you can humiliate me in my own home? You humiliated yourself, Dmitry replied, by trying to shame a child for the crime of being talented. Now please leave us. We have much to discuss. As Herr Reinhardt stormed from the room, Elena felt her mother's arms wrap around her. Maria was crying and laughing at the same time, holding her daughter like she might disappear if she let go. Did that really just happen? Elena whispered. I think it did, my love, Maria whispered back. I think it really did. Professor Hoffman approached them, his face still showing shock. I must apologize. I taught in that room for months and I never noticed what you were learning. I should have seen it. You played beautifully, Elena said. I learned from the best. The professor smiled for the first time since she'd met him. No, child. I played correctly. You played with soul. There's a difference. As the evening continued around them, as guests came forward to congratulate Elena and welcome Maria to her new life, as Dmitri began making plans for Elena's first real lesson, the girl felt something shift inside her chest. It was hope, real solid hope, the kind that didn't disappear when you woke up in the morning. But somewhere in the back of her mind she remembered Herr Reinhardt's parting words. This isn't over, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he meant it. The cottage that Dmitri Volkov provided was smaller than the servant quarters at the Reinhardt mansion, but it felt like a palace to Elena and her mother. It had a real fireplace, windows that didn't leak when it rained, and most importantly, it sat just 50 meters from the main house where a piano waited for Elena every single day. The first month passed in a blur of wonder and exhaustion. Elena woke before sunrise each morning, practiced for 2 hours before breakfast, attended regular school until afternoon, then spent 3 more hours with either Dmitri or Professor Hoffman, who had eagerly accepted Dmitri's offer to continue as Elena's teacher. After dinner, she practiced again until her mother gently reminded her that even gifted pianists needed sleep. Your fingers will fall off if you keep this up, Maria said one evening, watching her daughter work through the same challenging passage for the 20th time. Just 5 more minutes. Mama, Elena replied, not taking her eyes off the sheet music. I almost have it, but it wasn't all perfect. The other students at the conservatory made sure of that. Elena had been enrolled as a special student, allowed to take classes with children who had been studying formally for years. Most came from wealthy families. All of them had proper training since they were small, and none of them appreciated the girl in the patched dress who played better than they did, despite having only a few months of real instruction. She probably can't even read music. Elena overheard one girl whisper during a theory class. She just memorizes everything by ear like a trained monkey. My father says she's only here because she's a charity case, another student added. Dmitri Volkov feels sorry for her. It won't last. Elena pretended not to hear, but the words stung. They stung even more because part of her worried they might be true. What if her talent ran out? What if she had just gotten lucky that night at the Reinhardt mansion? What if she didn't actually belong here? Professor Hoffman noticed her struggling during a lesson one afternoon. She had been working on a Beethoven sonata for weeks, and her playing had become mechanical and lifeless. Stop, he said gently. What's wrong? Nothing. I'm just not playing it correctly. You're playing every note perfectly. That's the problem. He closed the sheet music and gestured for her to move over on the piano bench so he could sit beside her. When you played the Chopin that first night, what were you thinking about? Elena thought back to that evening. I wasn't thinking at all. I was just in feeling. Exactly. And now you're thinking too much. He placed his hands on the keys and played a simple melody. Do you know why music matters, Elena? It's not about hitting the right notes at the right time. Any machine can do that. Music matters because it lets us share feelings that we can't put into words. But the other students have had years of training in technique. That's valuable, but you have something they may never have. You have the ability to make people feel. Don't lose that while you're learning the rest. That night, Elena lay awake in bed, thinking about what Professor Hoffman had said. Through the thin walls of the cottage, she could hear her mother humming softly as she mended clothes by lamplight. That sound, that simple melody her mother always hummed when she thought Elena was asleep, suddenly gave her an idea. The next day during her practice time, instead of working on assigned pieces, Elena started playing the melody her mother hummed. She built on it, added harmonies, created variations. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was honest. It was theirs. What's that you're playing? Dmitri asked, walking into the music room unexpectedly. Elena's hands froze on the keys. I'm sorry. I should be practicing the Beethoven. Don't apologize. Play it again. She did, this time without stopping. When she finished, she turned to find Dmitri smiling. That's the Elena I heard that first night. That's the musician you're meant to be. He sat down in the chair by the window. Do you know what my greatest fear is for you? Elena shook her head. That the conservatory will train the magic out of you. That you'll learn to play correctly but forget how to play honestly. He leaned forward. Never let anyone convince you that technique matters more than truth. Yes, learn your scales, master your arpeggios, study the great composers, but never stop playing from here. He tapped his chest over his heart. Word of Elena's progress spread through Vienna's music circles. 6 months after that fateful evening, Dmitri arranged for her to give a small recital. Just a few select guests, he said. Nothing too overwhelming. But when Elena walked onto the small stage at the conservatory's recital hall, she felt her confidence falter. The audience included some of the most important musicians in Vienna. These people would know if she made mistakes. They would hear every imperfect note, every hesitation, every moment of doubt. Her mother sat in the front row wearing the new dress that Dmitri had insisted on buying her. Maria's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Elena could see the worry in her eyes despite her encouraging smile. Elena sat at the piano and looked at her hands. They were shaking. The first piece on her program was a Bach prelude, the same one Wilhelm had struggled with during those early lessons she'd watched. It felt like a lifetime ago. She placed her fingers on the keys and took a breath. Then another. The silence stretched on. Come on, she told herself. You can do this. You've practiced 1,000 times, but the notes wouldn't come. Her mind went blank. She couldn't remember how the piece started. Panic rose in her throat. Then she heard it. That soft humming, her mother's melody barely audible from the front row. Maria was humming, so quietly that probably no one else could hear, giving her daughter something familiar to hold on to. Elena closed her eyes and let the panic wash over her, then through her, then away. When she opened them again, she didn't look at the audience or the sheet music. She looked at her mother, and she began to play. The Bach came easily after that. So did the Mozart that followed, and the Chopin after that. But it was the final piece, the melody she had created from her mother's humming, that changed the room. Elena had spent weeks expanding it, developing it into something more complete. She called it Lullaby for a Working Mother, though she hadn't told anyone the name as she played. She thought about all those nights in their old apartment when Maria would come home exhausted and still hum, while she cooked dinner. She thought about her mother's rough hands, worn from years of scrubbing floors and washing dishes. She thought about the sacrifices Maria had made, the dreams she had set aside, the love she had poured into raising a daughter alone. The music swelled and softened, climbed and fell, spoke of exhaustion and hope and unconditional love. When the final notes faded away, Elena looked up to find half the audience in tears. The applause was thunderous, but Elena only saw her mother, who was crying and smiling at the same time, pride shining in her eyes. After the recital, as guests crowded around to congratulate her, Elena noticed a face she recognized near the back of the hall. Wilhelm stood there with Professor Hoffman, both of them clapping. Wilhelm caught her eye and nodded once, a gesture of respect she had never expected from him. But there was another face too, half hidden behind a column. A face that made Elena's blood run cold. Herr Reinhardt stood in the shadows, his expression unreadable. As Elena stared, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing through the hall. Don't worry about him, Dmitri said, appearing at her elbow. He had followed her gaze. Men like Reinhardt don't matter in the end. Only the music matters. But Elena couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. Herr Reinhardt had been there watching her triumph, and she remembered his words from that night months ago. This isn't over. Later that evening, as Elena and her mother walked back to their cottage under the stars, Maria squeezed her daughter's hand. I'm so proud of you, little one. You helped me, Mama. When I was scared, you were there. I'll always be there, Maria promised, but neither of them could have known that everything was about to be tested in a way they had never imagined. The next morning would bring news that would shake their new life to its foundation. Because while Elena had been building her dream, Herr Reinhardt had been building his revenge. And it was about to arrive. The letter arrived 3 days after Elena's recital. Dmitri found it slipped under his front door early in the morning, sealed with official wax and marked with the crest of the Vienna Conservatory Board of Directors. He read it twice before walking to the cottage where Maria and Elena were having breakfast. One look at his face told them something was terribly wrong. What is it? Maria asked, setting down her coffee cup. Dmitri handed her the letter without a word. Maria's face went pale as she read, her lips moving silently over the formal words. When she finished, her hands were shaking. I don't understand, Elena said, looking between them. What does it say? Someone has filed a formal complaint with the conservatory board, Dmitri said carefully. They're claiming that your admission was improper, that you don't meet the requirements for enrollment. But you sponsored me. You said that was allowed. It is allowed. But the complaint argues that I showed favoritism based on other factors. He chose his words delicately. They're saying I only took you as a student because of the spectacle at the Reinhardt party. That I haven't properly evaluated your abilities through the standard entrance examinations. Elena felt her stomach drop. Herr Reinhardt did this. The complaint is anonymous, but yes, I suspect he's behind it. Dmitri sat down heavily at their small kitchen table. He's been very clever about it, too. He's found legitimate grounds to challenge your enrollment. Technically, you should have gone through the formal audition process. So what happens now? Maria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. There will be a hearing in 2 weeks. The board will decide whether Elena can remain at the conservatory. Dmitri looked at Elena with fierce determination. But we're not going to let them take this away from you. We'll prove that you belong there beyond any doubt. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Elena's life. News of the hearing spread through the conservatory like wildfire. Some students were sympathetic, but others whispered that maybe Elena had gotten special treatment, that maybe she didn't really belong. My father says it's about maintaining standards, one boy said loudly enough for Elena to hear. The conservatory has a reputation to protect. Elena threw herself into practice with an intensity that worried even Dmitri. She would play until her fingers cramped, until her mother had to physically pull her away from the piano. Every note had to be perfect. Every piece had to be flawless. She couldn't give them any reason to send her away. You're going to hurt yourself, Professor Hoffman warned after finding her in the practice room at midnight. This isn't healthy. I have to be ready, Elena said, her eyes red from exhaustion and unshed tears. I have to show them I belong. You already belong. You've always belonged. He sat down beside her on the bench. But you won't prove anything if you're too exhausted to play. The night before the hearing, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the clock tick, imagining everything that could go wrong. What if her fingers froze like they had at the beginning of her recital? What if she made mistakes? What if the board decided that a housekeeper's daughter had no place among Vienna's musical elite? Around 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and went to sit in the small garden outside their cottage. The moon was nearly full, painting everything in silver light. Can't sleep either. Her mother's voice came from the doorway. Elena shook her head. Maria came out and wrapped a shawl around both their shoulders, pulling her daughter close. I'm scared, Mama, Elena whispered. I know, little one. What if they take it all away? What if tomorrow they decide I'm not good enough? Maria was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. Do you remember when you were very small, maybe 4 years old, and you heard a street musician playing violin? Elena nodded. She had a vague memory of stopping to listen, completely entranced. You stood there for an hour, refusing to leave until he finished his entire repertoire. When I finally dragged you away, you cried for the rest of the day. Maria smiled at the memory. That night you hummed every single melody he had played. Perfectly. You were 4 years old and you had memorized hours of music from hearing it once. I don't remember that. I do. And I knew then that music wasn't just something you liked. It was part of who you are. Maria turned to face her daughter. Tomorrow, whatever the board decides, that doesn't change. They can take away your enrollment, your access to their pianos, your place in their classes, but they cannot take away your gift. That's yours forever. Elena felt tears sliding down her cheeks. But I want to study. I want to learn everything I can. I want to become the best pianist I can be. And you will. One way or another, you will. But not because they give you permission. Because you refuse to let anything stop you. The hearing took place in the conservatory's grand assembly hall. The board sat at a long table at the front, 7 stern-faced men and women in formal attire. The room was packed with observers. Elena spotted Wilhelm and Professor Hoffman in the 3rd row. The elderly woman in pearls from the party sat near the front, offering Elena an encouraging nod. And there, in the back corner, sat Herr Reinhardt. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wanted her to see him, wanted her to know he was the one doing this. The head of the board, a woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, called the hearing to order. We are here to evaluate the admission of Elena Kaufmann to the Vienna Conservatory, she began, her voice echoing through the hall. A formal complaint has been filed arguing that standard procedures were not followed. Dmitry Volkov, you sponsored this student's admission. Please state your case. Dmitry stood and spoke eloquently about that night at the Reinhardt mansion, about Elena's extraordinary talent, about her rapid progress over the past months. He presented testimonials from Professor Hoffman and other teachers. He showed the program from her recital and the glowing reviews it had received. When he finished, another board member spoke up. This is all very impressive, but the fact remains that the student did not complete the standard entrance examination. Every other student at this institution had to audition before a panel of judges. They had to demonstrate proficiency in music theory, sight reading, and performance. How can we know if this student actually meets our standards? Then test her, Dmitry said simply. Right here, right now. Give her any examination you would give to a prospective student. Let her prove herself. The board members conferred in whispers. Finally, the silver-haired woman nodded. Very well. Elena Kaufman, please approach the piano. Elena's legs felt like water as she walked to the grand piano positioned to one side of the hall. This was it. Everything came down to this moment. We will begin with sight reading, the woman said. A board member brought forward a piece of music and placed it on the stand. You will have 2 minutes to look at this piece. Then you will play it. This is a composition by a contemporary composer that you could not have encountered before. Elena studied the music. It was complex, full of unusual time signatures and chromatic passages. Her heart pounded as the 2 minutes ticked away. Time, the woman announced. You may begin. Elena took a deep breath and began to play. The piece was challenging, but she navigated it carefully, only stumbling once over a particularly tricky rhythm. When she finished, she looked up at the board, trying to read their expressions. Adequate, one man said, making notes. Now, music theory. Please explain the circle of fifths and demonstrate its application. For the next hour, they tested her relentlessly. Theory questions, scales, arpeggios, more sight reading, performances of pieces by Bach, Mozart, and Liszt. Elena answered every question, played every piece, demonstrated every technique they demanded. She was exhausted and her fingers ached, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Finally, the silver-haired woman held up her hand. That will be sufficient. The board will now deliberate. The board members huddled together, speaking in voices too low to hear. Elena stood by the piano, her heart hammering so hard she felt dizzy. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. The silence in the hall was suffocating. Finally, the woman stood. We have reached a decision. Elena Kaufman, your performance today was exceptional. Your sight-reading skills are advanced. Your theoretical knowledge, while still developing, shows solid understanding, and your technical abilities are remarkable for someone with only months of formal training. Elena held her breath. However, the woman continued, and Elena's heart sank. The question before us is not whether you are talented. The question is whether proper procedures were followed in your admission. Herr Reinhardt leaned forward in his seat, a small smile playing at his lips. After careful consideration, the woman said, We have determined that while the standard audition process was bypassed, the sponsorship by Dmitry Volkov was within the bounds of conservatory policy. Moreover, your performance today would have qualified you for admission through the normal channels. Therefore, the board finds no grounds to revoke your enrollment. The hall erupted in applause. Elena felt her knees buckle, and she had to grab the piano to stay upright. Her mother was crying in the front row. Dmitry was shaking hands with Professor Hoffman, both men grinning widely. Elena looked to the back of the room, but Herr Reinhardt was already gone. He had slipped out during the applause, disappearing like a bad dream. 5 years later, Elena gave her first full concert at the Vienna State Opera House. The program included works by the masters she had studied, but it opened with her own composition, expanded and refined. She called it From the Kitchen Table, and she dedicated it to her mother, who sat in the very first row, wearing a beautiful gown that Elena had bought for her. After the concert, as Elena took her bows before a standing ovation, she thought about that night in the Reinhardt mansion, the night a wealthy man had tried to humiliate a poor girl and instead had changed her life forever. She thought about everyone who had helped her along the way. Dmitry, who had seen her worth when others saw only a housekeeper's daughter. Professor Hoffman, who had taught her that technique and truth must work together. Wilhelm, who had eventually apologized and become a friend. Her mother, who had given her everything, but mostly she thought about something her mother had told her that night before the hearing. They could take away opportunities, but they couldn't take away her gift. That was hers forever. And as the applause continued and flowers rained onto the stage, Elena knew that she would spend the rest of her life sharing that gift with anyone who wanted to listen, regardless of where they came from or what they could afford to pay. Because music, real music, belonged to everyone just like dreams did.